From Thom Hartmann's Daily Take Substack. Plenary Power, the Final Steps in Trump's American Autocracy. How the Insurrection Act could become the 21st Century Enabling Act, with 6 justices and the GOP standing by. Published October 10th, 2025. The following is a song inspired by this article.
You can hear it coming down the line, a march, not for freedom, but for power. There's a man in a gold tower saying law's just a word. Got his preachers and his princes twisting every truth they heard. He's got a book from the shadows where the old right burn, and the page he's reading from's the one where justice turns. Marching, marching, boots on the floor. Trump's march toward plenary power, keeping score. Friends to the banquet, enemies to the pyre. The law's just smoke in a world on fire. Now JD's quoting Schmidt by name, and Noom's lighting that old flame. They call it order, they call it right, but it's the same old fire in the night. There is no law, there's only might. That's what the jurors wrote before the light. The Reichstag burned, the people cried, and the Führer smiled while justice died. Now he's reaching for that act of insurrection, trying to call it resurrection, but the ghosts of 33 know that sound. That's a march of freedom going down. Marching, marching, boots on the floor. Trump's march toward plenary power, knocking on the door. Friends get rich as enemies expire. The courts turn silent. The truth's in the fire. No kings, no crowns, no liars, choir. Just one last song before the fire. March slow, America march slow. March slow, America march slow.
The endgame for Trump, Vance, Noem, and Bondi is coming into clearer focus, and it's nearly a one-for-one, step-by-step implementation of Nazi jurist, philosopher Carl Schmitt's ideas that created and sustained the early Third Reich. Vance has even gone so far as to directly quote Schmitt. These concepts aren't particularly complicated, and it's easy to see how Trump and his enablers are implementing them. First, Schmitt taught, quote, "There is no law, there's just power," end quote. Democracy is a messy anachronism in which whomever controls the political majority inevitably imposes their will on everybody else, stifling individuality and freedom in both thought and behavior. The cure for this messiness of democracy, he argued, is a strong leader who transcends politics, understands the people and reflects their true desires, defends their racial and religious identity, ignores inconvenient laws, and thus leads the superior majority race of people to their true identity. A fascist dictator, in other words. Second, the way the noble dictator rises to, quote, plenary and, quote, ultimate unchallengeable power is by discarding participation in the political process, contemptuously ignoring norms, breaking previous promises, flaunting national laws while blowing up negotiations, and refusing to compromise with, quote, inferior, end quote, political parties or political ideas. Instead, Schmitt says, quote, a true leader, end quote, puts every institution and person in the nation into one of two binary buckets, quote, friends, end quote, or, quote, enemies, end quote. Friends are lavishly and publicly rewarded with wealth and power. Enemies are relentlessly pursued and conspicuously punished until they're either neutralized, bankrupted, or dead. Third, the way to get past the guardrails built into constitutional republics like the German 1930s Weimar Republic or today's American Republic is by invoking, quote, emergency, end quote, powers, even if it's necessary to create an emergency to justify the invocation. When J.D. Vance sat down with New York Times columnist Russ Dutat in May of last year, he complained that Democrats opposing Brett Kavanaugh's appointment to the Supreme Court weren't interested in Kavanaugh's legal positions, but rather whether he would serve or oppose Democratic Party political efforts. He said, quote, "The next thing I kept thinking about liberalism in 2019 and 2020 is that these guys have all read Carl Schmitt. Quote, there's no law, there's just power, end quote." Not only has Vance apparently read Schmitt, his mentor and benefactor, Peter Thiel, has, according to extensive reporting in Wired magazine, long been fascinated by the Nazi theorists' ideas. While it's unlikely that Trump could tell Schmitt from Fred Flintstone, he instinctively understands the man's theories. He's systematically following them, starting with his flouting norms and laws like the Hatch Act, 2 years in prison for selling Teslas in front of the White House, and both United States and international laws against selling pardons and killing citizens in boats in the Caribbean without trial and conviction. And that's just the beginning. Taking a jet as an illegal bribe, giving the UAA high-tech chips in violation of America's national security in exchange for a $2 billion investment in Trump family's crypto business, and exempting companies that gave him gifts or money from antitrust regulation, tariffs, and Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcements continue to trend. From there, Trump moved to Schmitt's friends' enemies doctrine, maliciously punishing his perceived enemies, even when, like Comey, Taylor, and Clapper, they're Republicans. As South American strongman Oscar Benavides famously said, quote, "For my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law," end quote. He's characterized Democrats in terms never before used by an American president to describe members of his opposition party, using words typically reserved for traitors and criminals. This is incredibly wrong and destructive, which is why George Washington warned against it, and no president has ever done it. His friends, though, even if they took a $50,000 bribe in a paper bag in a sting, Holman or looked the other way as Repstein raped little girls during her 8 years as Florida's top law enforcement, Bondi, can do no wrong. Attack the Capitol and cause the death of 3 police officers, you get a pardon, and now it appears even compensation. And now he's preparing to use the sledgehammer that Hitler wielded to destroy the German Constitution, taking it as a club to seize absolute plenary power. He's taking visible steps toward invoking a nationwide state of emergency. Schmitt first advanced this idea in 1933 when a Dutch communist set fire to the German Parliament Reichstag building, describing what we call a state of emergency as a, quote, state of exception, end quote, Ausnahmezustand. During such an, quote, exception, end quote, or even phony amount of, quote, emergency, end quote, Schmitt said, a leader could, indeed, should, use it as an excuse to ignore normal constitutional requirements and laws because the urgency of the exception supersedes the law in order to preserve the republic. Using this process, Schmitt argued, would allow a, quote, noble Führer, end quote, with his finger on the pulse of his people to end around around the tedious, laborious, normal, legal, and ethical processes by which a nation's leader normally executed the law. It would let him become initially above the law, as 6 Republicans on the Supreme Court have endorsed, and ultimately become the law himself and rule by decree or executive order. Former Labor Secretary Robert Reich called out Trump's 4-step plan to achieve Schmidt's goal of plenary power. Summary in my words, not his. Number 1, deploy ICE to blue cities with brutal tactics that intentionally inflame local people to protest. Number 2, exaggerate the, quote, crisis, end quote, to try to provoke the protesters to violence. 3, deploy troops to further polarize and inflame local sentiment, evoking physical resistance to their presence that justifies arrests and live ammunition, a Tiananmen Square of sorts. 4, citing that resistance, invoking the Insurrection Act of 1807 to suspend parts of federal law and the Constitution so you can use the troops to steal the 2026 and 2028 elections for the GOP. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker has echoed that narrative, explicitly saying that the goal of Trump's, quote, invasion, end quote, is to control and corrupt the elections next year and in 2028. And Governor Gavin Newsom has echoed this sentiment. Trump's behavior is a virtual mirror of the steps Schmidt recommended after the Reichstag fire, and Hitler followed in both the enabling acts. They made it legal to prepare lists of your political enemies to use the state against, and his political assassinations during the later Night of the Long Knives, for which Schmidt wrote the legal justification. Like so many of us across the nation, Robert Reich is basically begging people not to take the bait Trump is dangling. So far, here in Portland, for example, Trump's and Noam's attempts at provocation have been met with street theater, dancing furries, people bringing flowers to the ICE building, and a naked bike ride protest. But the ICE guys, laughing, shot a praying priest in the head from the roof of the ICE building, hitting him with a pepper ball that knocked him to the ground. Baffled, Kristi Noem told Trump and America in a cabinet meeting yesterday that Portland must have, quote, cleared, end quote, the, quote, war-torn, end quote, areas and hidden part of the city that are smoking ruins from the recent riots she imagines, and Fox, quote, News, end quote, lyingly suggests by playing a 5-year-old B-roll of the Black Lives Matter protests have happened. Quote, Mayor Keith Wilson said that Portland was perfectly safe, a beautiful city, no problems. And I said, quote, well, why did you clear the streets for me today then and build out a 4-block radius to make sure I could get in and out of there, end quote. Lacking any evidence whatsoever of organized violence against ICE officers or their building in Portland, the notorious puppy killer, her also married alleged boyfriend in tow, added, quote, this is a sick situation, but those are anarchists. Those are people that want to overthrow government. They're really degenerates. And we're finding out who is supplying all those beautiful signs and everything else, end quote. So far, Portland, Los Angeles, and Chicago have succeeded in not giving in to Trump's and Noam's Schmittian provocations. Odds are, though, they'll continue to ramp up the violence until finally a breaking point is reached and Trump can then claim justification for the Insurrection Act, something he's now openly discussing, almost daily. Stephen Miller seems to be salivating at the prospect, telling CNN that, quote, under Title X, the presidency has plenary authority, end quote, and then suddenly realizing that he slipped it and let the cat out of the bag, he froze for the next dozen or so seconds until CNN claimed technical difficulties and cut away. When they came back, Miller admitted that, quote, plenary, end quote, a word Carl Schmitt so loved, which means, quote, absolute power that nobody can challenge, end quote, from his final remarks. In federal court in Chicago yesterday, U.S. Deputy Attorney General Eric Hamilton said, quote, the president's judgment is unreviewable, end quote, echoing Schmidt. As historian Heather Cox Richardson explained, quote, it is this power under Title X that White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller yesterday claimed was, quote, plenary, end quote, or absolute. The idea that exceptions to the rule of law reveal who is really in charge of the government was central to the central political philosophy of German political theorist Carl Schmitt, who joined the Nazis and whose work is increasingly popular with the radical right in the U.S. these days, end quote. Forbes notes that Trump is already claiming that if the courts try to stop him, he'll neuter them by invoking the Insurrection Act, claiming it gives him plenary powers. Quote, Trump has suggested he would be inclined to invoke the law if courts rule against him. Quote, if people were being killed and courts were holding us up, or governors or mayors are holding us up, sure, I'll do that, end quote, Trump said Monday, referring to use of the Insurrection Act. The next few days, weeks, or possibly months will be pivotal. Will citizens in one of the blue cities Trump's thugs have invaded give him the riot he wants? If they do, and he invokes the Insurrection Act, will the 6 compliant, frightened Republicans on the Supreme Court back him up? If they don't, will he ignore them and undergo and order the military into our streets to establish martial law anyway? Will the nation's military commanders go along with such an order? And if they do, can they effectively stop or disrupt the elections of 2026 and 28 in blue cities? We even had elections during the Civil War and World War II. Most Americans, polls showed, are aghast. Few of us ever thought we'd live to see the day an American president would be following the steps to cripple a republic laid out by Nazi Germany's most famous political theorist. But here we are. And the most important things we can do are to fearlessly keep speaking out, quote, courage is courageous, end quote, demand action from our elected officials of both parties, and show up peacefully in the streets on October 18th for No King's Day 2. See you there.